Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who do not know me, I'm David Bell, the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Reading. I'm delighted to welcome you all here this evening. If you're a regular, welcome back. If this is your first visit, a very special welcome to you. I'm delighted that this is the third of our 2015-16 public lectures, but the first to celebrate our 90th anniversary as a university. Whilst we received our university charter in 1926, the history of the university and advanced education goes back a bit further than that, hence the title of tonight's lecture. We have an exciting programme of events to mark the 90th anniversary, which will run throughout 2016. Indeed, you're the first people to see part of our 90th anniversary exhibition, which is out in the foyer. Let me just say we've had great fun trawling through the archives and the records, and some interesting as well as some amusing bits of our history have emerged. But the real purpose of tonight, of course, is the lecture given not by one, but two colleagues here at the university, Mr. Stephen Burt and Dr. Roger Brugge from the Department of Meteorology. Let me just say a little bit about them, because as will become very obvious, they have serious credentials to be talking on this subject tonight. Stephen first became interested in weather observation when he was still at school. After a physics degree and 8 years working at the Met Office, which was then in Bracknell, as many of you will remember, he broadened his career by studying for a marketing degree and working for several multinational companies over the next 25 years. But meteorology was burning brightly in his soul throughout. And just to demonstrate that, in 2012, Cambridge University Press published his textbook guide to weather observing, the Weather Observer's Handbook. And later that year, as perhaps coming home, maybe we might say, he returned to university to undertake a master's degree in applied meteorology here at Reading. And then in late 2013, he joined us as a science writer within the Department of Meteorology. He's been a Fellow of the Royal Meteorological Society for over 30 years, is Chairman of the Royal Meteorological Society's South East Branch, and a regular Deputy Observer for the university's Atmospheric Observatory. Let me turn now to Roger. Believe it or not, his interest in weather started at school as well, when he first began running his own weather station. A hobby, I think it would be fair to say, that developed into a research interest all the way through to the present day. Following on from a physics degree, he obtained a PhD at Imperial College studying meteorology, and has spent most of his working life developing and using computer models that simulate the workings of both the atmosphere and the ocean. Roger has helped run local weather stations over many years and currently oversees the processing and archiving from the university's manual and automatic weather stations. And he's indeed devised several of the web pages that portray meteorology and weather at the university. Roger is also a Fellow of the Royal Meteorological Society and was formerly editor of the Society's popular weather magazine. He currently serves as a member of the Governing Council of the Meteorological Society. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're in great hands this evening, and I'd like you now, if you would, to welcome to the front Roger and Stephen.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Excellent to see such a turnout. So our topic this evening is 100 years of Reading weather. In fact, going to be slightly more than 100 years. So this project really started several years ago. We knew that we had the records from the observatory digitised back to 1968, which is when the observatory, the weather station, moved here from London Road, as Roger will cover in a few moments. But we knew there were earlier records. We had manuscript records back to, we thought, about the First World War. So I had a hunt around in the Met Office archives in Exeter and discovered records back to 1908. So we couldn't not accept that as a challenge, and so Roger's done most of the digitisation of the records back to that period. So Roger will be covering the details of those weather observations, and from there were several, to use the Vice-Chancellor's phrase, amusing and interesting weather events which we'd like to cover, and we've got some excellent photographs from local history groups which we can illustrate those as well. So after that, Roger will talk a little bit about is our climate changing, and then we'll have a brief overview of what perhaps we can expect over the next 100 years. So let me hand over without further ado to Roger.
So we're better to start than 90 years ago, 17th of March 1926, Charter Day. Yes, we were doing a fairly comprehensive set of weather observations in those days. Note in particular that we were doing soil temperature measurements at depths of 1 feet and 4 feet, as befits a university with its roots in the agricultural sciences. It was a fairly cool day. Remember, this is mid-March. Temperature didn't rise above 9.5 degrees, but there was no frost at night. We weren't doing sunshine measurements in those days, but we know there was no rainfall on the day. In fact, we were in the middle of a 15-day dry spell, so quite a good time to start celebrating a new lease of life as a fully fledged university. So when did the observations start? Well, we've got rainfall data from the University College as it was in those days, going back to 1901, when the University College had a few small buildings just at the back of what is now Reading's Town Hall in Valpy Street and Forbury Garden area. 1908, we started making what we term climatological observations. So that's the full set of temperatures, rainfall, soil temperatures, observations of the wind and things like that. Every day, 9 o'clock in the morning. And these started at 1908, shortly after the college had moved into what is now known as the London Road campus. Observations were managed over the years by several departments, the so-called geographical, which became the geography department, physics and geophysics also helped out. And it wasn't until about 1987 that meteorology itself as a department took over the running of the observations. As you can see from the map there, the London Road campus was quite a small campus, and in 1968 we moved to the much more spacious White Knights campus where we are today. So here's a picture from 1952 at London Road. Very sheltered, enclosed. Notice the proximity of a couple of trees, tall buildings, and a couple of manhole covers in the foreground. We were making soil temperature measurements, so let's hope that the pipework from those ran left to right across the picture and not top to bottom. The exposure had improved a little bit by 1963. We were now using a larger Stevenson screen. We had a couple of rain gauges, you can see there shown in dark. There's a large one which is actually giving us the times at which the rain fell, and the smaller one is giving us the daily rainfall totals. And by this time, we were also making sunshine measurements. There was a sunshine recorder, probably not too dissimilar to the one that you've seen outside the building here, outside the lecture theatre, planted on top of one of the campus buildings around this quadrangle. Here's an aerial view, courtesy of Google Earth, of the atmospheric observatory as it was in 2008 on the White Knights campus site. Circled in yellow, hardly a building in sight. Certainly in the earlier years, this building in the bottom right-hand corner wasn't there. It's a fairly new development. So lots of greenery. Most of that greenery is actually grass. A few trees, which tend to be down on the left-hand side in the dip as you go down towards White Knights Lake. So a really good exposure, and clearly a totally different exposure to the inner city London Road site, shall we say. In fact, we know that the temperature measurements here were about 0.5 degree lower than those at London Road, something that has to be borne in mind when we start comparing old and new observations. And here's a ground level shot of the university as it is today, of the University Atmospheric Observatory. In the foreground, on the bottom right side of the picture, is the area where we do our day-to-day 9 o'clock climatological observations with the Stevenson screen and various rain gauges, some of you might be able to make out. And further over to the left of the picture is our sort of research and teaching area. We do quite a lot of teaching of instrumentation to students. We do research projects, we develop instrumentation, and all that goes on within this fairly spacious, it has to be said, observatory site. Here's a copy of our observational record showing that as far back as 1908 we were doing daily measurements of rainfall, highest and lowest temperatures, soil temperatures, that's the T30 measurement, as well as the daily 9 o'clock observations. Grass minimum temperatures started being observed in 1920. That's where you have a thermometer placed at grass tip level, and that's the measurement that produces the so-called ground frost measurements. If that drops below freezing, then we have a ground frost. Sunshine measurements started in 1956, and about 4 years later we started making continuous records of the rainfall. When we moved to the more spacious White Knights campus, great, we had a lot more room, and we put up a 10-metre mast, which meant that we could start doing continuous records of the wind, literally every second of the day, in those days on paper charts, because this was, of course, sort of before the advent of automatic weather stations. And we also started making measurements of solar radiation, so not just the sunshine, but the actual intensity of radiation, because we had such a good field of view now. We weren't, our view of the sky wasn't obscured by too many trees or buildings. We've been very lucky that since about 1918, the weather station has been run by just 5 principal observers. In fact, 2 of them, these 2 chaps here, Ken Spears and Mike Stroud, are actually in the audience somewhere tonight. And having such a small number of principal observers is important, because whenever observations are made, there's always room for error, and having someone who can do the same methodical check day by day by day, knows what's happened in the past, will have an idea of whether you've made a mistake. Just writing down a number in your logbook when you're out on the field site is invaluable. And this helps to maintain the consistency and the continuity of the day-to-day records of the site. And we've got a small army of deputies, Stephen and myself are amongst them, who occasionally go out and help with a 9 o'clock observation to give Mike, as it is now, our current observer, the odd weekend off perhaps. Because remember, we do this every day of the year. And it's also important to stress that we've got a very good group of technicians, because things always break, need fixing, need mending, or we ask for a new instrument or something to be installed, and they're always very willing to help us out in that. And again, this helps maintain the continuity of the record. So what current observations are made at that field site that we saw earlier? Well, we have the manual 9 o'clock observations, as I said, made every day of the year. In fact, I was the one who drew the short straw last Christmas. We have a standalone Met Office automatic weather station which sends back hourly reports to the Met Office in Exeter, so they can monitor the weather hour by hour should anything interesting happen across Berkshire or Reading. We have a variety of experimental teaching research instruments for use, including those that we use for student projects, particularly in the summer months. And all this is backed up by a very sophisticated electronic instrumentation system which records the weather and logs it every 1 second of the day. And what's shown on the right-hand side here is the winds that we've had earlier this week, Sunday and Monday. In particular, the red line is worth looking at. This is the peak wind gust. You can see across the top of the picture there, we've got 50 miles an hour marked. And just before midnight, that's last thing on Sunday, and at about midday on Monday, we had wind gusts here in Reading due to that recent storm of very close to 50 miles an hour. Hence the damage that was caused and to local trees in 1 or 2 places around the area. And so this is the sort of thing which you can actually see on our website in real time. What instrumental observations do we make these days? Air pressure, using the barometer shown on the left-hand side, traditional mercury barometer. We make measurements of the air temperature and the humidity at 9 o'clock, along with the highest and lowest values of temperature over the last 24 hours. And this enables us, for example, to determine the number of days with air frost each month. We do temperature measurements of the surface of the ground, so not just above grass tips to give us the ground frost, but also of the surface of the soil and of concrete surfaces. Concrete surfaces might seem a strange thing to measure, but it's a measurement that's been made at climatological stations like ours for about 40, 50 years. It goes back to the days before they started putting automatic weather stations alongside of motorways. But they needed a way of trying to find out the physics and the meteorology of tarmac and road surfaces, pavements. How often would they freeze over? How likely would ice be to form? We still do soil temperature measurements, only down to 100 centimetres these days, not to 4 feet. We measure precipitation, sunshine, and wind direction and speed, as in also including the maximum wind gusts, as you saw before. How do we do these measurements? Well, you've seen outside a small Stevenson screen, the little white Louvre box. Here's a slightly larger one that we use day to day, which holds 4 thermometers, which allows us to determine the highest and lowest temperature. That's the maximum and minimum thermometers. And we also have a dry and wet bulb thermometers, and this gives us the current air temperature. And the wet bulb temperature is normally lower than the dry bulb one, and the difference between the two tells us how wet or dry the air is, what the humidity of the air is. Nowadays, these are being replaced by electronic instruments, as shown on the right-hand side in the small inset. Just one humidity probe, that's the slightly fatter white sensor on the left-hand side, pointing upwards, and on the right-hand side, there's a temperature probe. So 2 instruments as opposed to 4. Sounds useful. Problem is that when you've got 4 instruments and one goes wrong, you can sort of cross-compare and you know that maybe one of them is wrong. If one of these breaks or starts misreading by a degree, how do you know? Precipitation, again, our 9 o'clock observations are made by the instruments on the left-hand side. The rain falls through the funnel, is collected in the glass bottle, and then the amount of water in the bottle is measured using the thin, tapered measuring cylinder, which I'm holding there in my left hand. And on the right is a modern instrument. It might look like a sort of fancy wine glass, but it's actually what we call a tipping bucket rain gauge, which it's a bit like a pair of scales inside, and the rain alternately fills one side of the scale, then the other, and it tips backwards and forwards, and you get an electronic count every 1/5 of a millimetre. Sunshine, again, you've seen an instrument like the one on the left outside. It's traditional, sort of what I call the sort of Madame Zaza's fortune-telling glass ball sunshine recorder, Campbell-Stokes sunshine recorder, to give it its proper name. And on the right is the modern electronic equivalent. And the two clearly are going to measure things slightly differently. This is a bit like the little schoolboy who uses a magnifying glass to burn a pile of leaves or dust. And you might be able to see a sort of burn trace on the green card. Wind speed and direction, well, there's our 10-metre mast, the taller of the two, and we also have a research mast to the left-hand side. You can see lots of these little anemometers going upwards at various heights, and this allows us to teach students how the wind speed varies as you get close to the ground, because as you get close to the ground, the drag and the friction caused by the ground tends to slow down the wind. Non-instrumental observations, well, we still do lots of those. Human ears and eyes, and even a measuring stick are very useful here. Many of these can be done automatically these days, but at great expense and not, it has to be said, totally reliably. So, where can you find out about all this data? Well, there's the URL at the bottom there, which is our departmental university weather data webpage. And we've got links there to our real-time automatic weather station data, which we update every 10 minutes. The website is packed with graphs and tables. You can even receive an automatic email in your inbox every morning, giving you the 9 o'clock weather report from the university. And as Stephen has said, we've got this long period data set of records, which goes back for the climatological observations, everything, to about 1908. And if you're interested in a copy of some or all of that for research purposes, then get in touch. And here's another couple of pages that you'll also find on the website. This is actually showing current conditions so far this month, February. Left-hand graph shows you in solid red the highest temperature each day, the lowest temperature each day in solid blue, and you can see that those are above the respective dotted lines. The dotted lines are what we'd expect from climatology. So every day's been, again, much warmer this month than we would expect. In fact, we've not had an air frost this month, although from the feel of things outside, that may be changing tonight. But so currently, we're running at about 3 degrees warmer than average. Not quite as hot as December, relatively speaking, but certainly better than January. And on the right, well, it's been warm, but it's also been wet. The black line shows the amount of rainfall we'd expect at various stages throughout the month. And the solid red curve, which is now shown at about 20 millimetres on the left-hand side, shows that we've had more rainfall than would normally be expected at this stage of the month. So it's been wet and mild, a bit like the rest of the winter, really.
Thanks, Roger. So one of the advantages of having a long record is it does enable us to have a bit of a perspective on individual records. We can look back on the period of records that we have. So, for instance, we can look back on today's records, the 10th of February, and we can see that in 1918 the temperature reached almost 14 degrees C. In 1953 it was a very stormy start to February. On the 1st of February there was a very severe storm in the North Sea which caused a lot of flooding and 300 people drowned in eastern England. And it was still stormy 10 days later because we recorded one of our lowest barometric pressures. But perhaps most relevant to today is 30 years ago today, we had the coldest February morning since 1947. It was a very cold February. In fact, it was one of our coldest months on record. Heavy snowfall about the 6th, 7th of the month. And as the skies began to clear a few days later, the temperature dropped rapidly. And today, 30 years ago today, we had a minimum temperature of minus 11.6. We haven't been as low as that since then. So that's clearly quite a significant event. And this photograph that you can see was actually taken 30 years ago today. By me, I should hasten to add, which makes me feel rather old, but never mind. But talking about extreme months, the record length that we have does give us, as I say, an idea of a perspective, and we can put extreme months into perspective. So what I've shown here are the 10 coldest months that we've recorded since our records began in 1908. And you might be surprised to find that several of them are relatively recently. The most recent being December 2010, which was a very cold month, and it also one of our coldest months. The coldest month we've recorded was January 1963, which I'm sure there'll be a good number of people in the audience who will remember that, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. Not to be outdone, let's have a look at the 10 hottest months. And there are many more of those recently than cold months, which is not surprising considering we've seen a considerable rise in mean temperatures. But even then, back at the beginning of the record, 1911, the summer of 1911 was a very hot summer. And in fact, our warmest month was July 2006. And again, we'll come back to that a little bit later on. Not to be outdone, let's have a look at the wettest months. And our wettest month was actually right at the very beginning of our record, October 1903, 180 millimetres of rain, about 3 times what we'd normally get. And considering how wet some of the winters have been recently, you might be surprised to see that there's actually not many blobs in the last 40 years. In fact, we haven't had one of our 10 wettest months since June 1971. So that's the perspective that we can put on this. And just to complete the picture, of course, here's the driest months. There are a few more of those recently, you'll be pleased to hear. April 2007 and April 2011 were both amongst our 10 driest months. Interestingly, those of you who are a little bit older than I am may remember 1947, and 1947 does actually have a warm and a cold month in the same year. So that was quite an extreme year. So another thing we can get from the long period records we've got is we can look at the daily averages. So what I'm showing here are the daily averages for the maximum temperature, the minimum temperature, and the average, which is the average of the maximum and the minimum for each day. So we can see that temperature doesn't actually change all that much from about the middle of December until the very end of February, and then it does begin to pick up into spring. But this week is on average the coldest week of the year in Reading. And in fact, we see a drop in temperatures now almost every year, and the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, is the only day of the year where the average minimum temperature in Reading falls below freezing. Now, whether there's any connection with Valentine's Day, couldn't possibly comment. But we can also map onto that the frequency of snow. So this is the number of days that snow had been observed, the blue lines, in 30 years. And in fact, this week, as well as being the coldest, is also the snowiest week of the year. It's the only week in the year where the chance of snow is greater than 1 in 2. So continuing the theme of snow, this is our record. We've got depth of snow records back to 1950. And what I've shown here is the accumulated snow depth for each of the winters back to 1950. And people quite often say to me, well, winters were much snowier when I was young, and we went out sledging every day. And well, the figures actually don't really bear that out, apart from the winter of 1963. And if you take that big spike off, you can see actually that there's not been that much variation over the last few years. In fact, the second snowiest winter we've had in the last 60 years was in 2009-10, so only 5 years ago. But we have had, we don't often get deep snow, but we have had some fairly heavy snowfalls in Reading over the past few years. So I've got some photographs, and I'd like to see if any of you remember any of these. So let's start with the first one. No takers for this one? No, I thought probably not. This is one of the most severe spring snowstorms of the 20th century, in fact. And this is one of the footpaths across Caversham at the end of April in 1908. And in Reading, there looks to be about maybe 15 centimetres of snow on the ground. But not far away, in Oxford and in Newbury, there was half a metre of snow. Half a metre of snow at the end of April. The other interesting thing about this was that this was the day before the first London Olympics opened. You imagine being the organiser and having a snowstorm like this the day before it opened. The other interesting thing is that the Olympics lasted until October, which probably meant you stand a better chance of getting tickets to that one. Here's another one. This is Cemetery Junction in Reading. Those of you from the Reading area will know this. It's hardly changed. This is Cemetery Junction. This is the Marquis of Granby pub. And this is after the Christmas snowstorm in 1927. Rained all day on Christmas Day, turned to sleet in the evening, turned to heavy snow later that day, snowed all day on Boxing Day, driven by a very strong northeasterly wind. You can see the snow plastered against the lampposts. And in Reading, there was, again, only about 15 centimetres of snow, but not far south of us, Basingstoke had half a metre of snow. And the railway line between Reading and Basingstoke was closed for snowdrifts for a week. The snow lasted about a week and then melted around New Year. February 1929, this is one of my favourite pictures. This is Valpy Street just behind us, Forbury Gardens behind us, and the horse trough is no longer there. But clearly this poor horse was desperately looking for a drink. And this was one of the coldest spells we've recorded. In fact, it still holds the record for our lowest February temperature. And the horse looks anything but chuffed at not being able to get a drink, doesn't he? The same event, February 1929, and this is particularly interesting and relevant to the university because this is White Knights Lake, so which of course is now part of the university campus, just 300 metres or so from where we are this evening. It's also interesting how many people have got skates. How many people in the audience possess a pair of skates? A small handful. Clearly in 1929 a lot more people did. Perhaps the winters they felt were colder or something, but there was a story that during this winter, after it melted, there was the carcass of a dead dog found in the lake, and I can imagine there's a lot worse things in the lake. So moving swiftly on, I think, to January 1940, another very cold month. In fact, this was the coldest month in southern England since February 1895. This is the Thames from Caversham Bridge. A few brave or foolhardy, perhaps, souls venturing out onto the ice, but clearly it was thick enough to bear weight. This caused enormous economic difficulties because at that time most of the Thames Valley was run by coal, both domestically and power stations, and the coal barges couldn't get up and down the Thames, and so there was very little coal for heating and for power generation. January 1963. I'm sure quite a few people remember January 1963. Certainly it's one of my earliest weather memories. This is a photograph taken in Prospect Park in Reading. The beginning of January 1963 saw our deepest snowfall that we've yet recorded at the university, 31 centimetres on the 3rd of January. And I suspect the newspaper photographer took this picture partly because of the interest of the snow, but also I suspect unusually seeing people on skis. Now, of course, it'd be much more common, but those days I suspect there were very few people actually had their own skis. Here's another one from the town in January 1963. I was a little bit younger than this, but not that much younger than this in January 1963, and I remember having 3 months of sledging and skating that winter, doing the same sort of thing as these young people. Who knows, maybe there's even somebody from the audience who was actually captured in this delightful photograph. Moving on 20 years to 1981 and 1982. Two very interesting and quite severe winter months. December 1981, we had a very heavy snowstorm right at the beginning of December. We don't often get very heavy snow at the beginning of December, before Christmas. It snowed heavily about the 7th of December. We had about 15 centimetres of snow. A few days later, the sky cleared. This picture was taken on the Saturday, the 12th of December. Clear blue skies, wonderful alpine scenery. Then the sun went down, the skies were still clear, and the temperature dropped like a stone, and it fell to -13 the following morning, Sunday the 13th. Still the lowest December temperature that we've recorded. Fortunately, the weather then became milder, and it was quite mild over Christmas, and then just after New Year it got cold again, and there was a terrific blizzard, probably the worst blizzard of the last generation, on the 8th of January 1982. The right-hand photograph was taken just outside Wokingham on the 10th of January, and you can see snowdrift about 2 metres deep. Not often you see that in Reading. And then again, a few days later, the sky cleared, the temperature fell to almost -15 on the 14th of January that year. And in fact, at Arborfield, at the university's farm at Arborfield, where we did measurements then, it fell to -18, and that's the lowest temperature yet recorded in Berkshire. Moving forward a few years to January 1987, this was a different sort of cold. It was a very, very cold and strong easterly wind, and it was a bitterly cold day, and the highest temperature of the day was -6.8, and that's the coldest day on Reading's record. In fact, it was the coldest day in southern England since 1740, so it would take a very long record to beat that. But I remember it was so cold that the salt that was put on the roads to defrost the ice and so on just didn't work, it was just too cold. And that's presumably what this snowplough was attempting to do. Moving forward a few years to December 2009, a fairly heavy snowfall just before Christmas. This was the 21st, if I remember rightly. Very thick, heavy, wet snow, accumulated very quickly, caused the most enormous traffic jam around Reading. Fortunately, I managed to get out of it before. This is one advantage of knowing what the forecast is going to be, you can see. And then just a couple of weeks later, the 6th of January 2010, we had our second deepest snowfall. And this is a picture of the observatory taken by one of our technicians the following morning. While it's quite interesting having this amount of snow, it is not only quite difficult to read the instruments when the snow is that deep, it's quite difficult to find the instruments when the snow is that deep. And this is a picture of Broad Street in central Reading on the same day, taken by Craig Selly from the Reading Library Service. And he had a brilliant title for this. Called it the lunchtime rush. And there was not much in the way of a rush that particular day. But moving on to looking at floods and droughts. I've mentioned our driest months. We have never had a month that's had no rain at all. We have had 3 months, 3 calendar months, where it's only rained on one day. And we have had a period of 37 days, twice, without rain. Summer of 1959 and the Great Summer of 1976. But our driest year still remains 1921. We haven't had a year anything like as dry as 1921. I mentioned our wettest month, October 1903, which had about 400 times the amount of rain of our driest month. And even though we've had some extremely wet weather in the winters in the last couple of years, we still haven't managed to beat the wettest 28-day spell, which was set all that time ago, back in 1929. However, 2014 was our third wettest year on record, our wettest year since 1951. But our wettest 12-month period we made it just over the metre of rain, 1,002 millimetres in 2000. This is a picture that we found in Reading Library, and it's a postcard, in fact, and it's labelled "Fire Engine Going to a Fire" in Oxford Road, 9th of June 1910. This is a nice horse-driven fire engine. If you look closely behind, you can see there's a tram there. There's people obviously not capable of going through the water. This is the rower bridge over the Oxford Road. And in fact, I recognise the date because this was probably not going to a fire. It was probably going to pump out a property because there was a terrific rainstorm in Caversham on that day. Around 80 millimetres fell in a couple of hours. So there was large parts of Reading really seriously flooded. Now, we've got used to seeing these pictures from the First World War over the last couple of years, and we tend to associate the First World War with muddy trenches. And I'd always assumed it was just the military equipment and the horses and everything moving it over the fields that did it. But in fact, when Roger and I went through the records, we found that the first 2 years of the First World War were the wettest 2 years that we've had here in Reading, and I guess probably so in the Low Countries as well. We had 3 years rainfall in 2 years, and that probably explains why the fields were quite so muddy. Here's one that a few people may remember. March 1947, terrific flooding on the Thames, very snowy February, and the weather got suddenly milder in March, and it all melted at once, and tremendous floods on the Thames. This is Vaston Road. These are the two railway bridges, still there. And this is what it looked like from the air. So here's Reading Station over here, and there's Reading Bridge and Caversham Bridge, and anybody live in Caversham? Right, well, this is what Caversham looked like in March 1947. Hopefully it'll never be quite as bad as that again, because obviously there's been a lot of work done on flood prevention and so on. But it does go to show, when there's that amount of water around, what the Thames can expand to. We don't get many summer floods in Reading, mainly because the ground's a bit drier and it can absorb a bit more water. But we did in July 2007, probably the heaviest summer flood we've had in 50 or 60 years. We had 69 millimetres in 15 hours, and this is the Kennet going through the Oracle, and you can see the water's up on the pavement on the side. And a few years later, just a couple of years ago, very wet winter of 2013-14, and the river went even higher, and you can see it's right up to the steps here. And if it had got another 5 centimetres higher, it would probably have started flooding the shops on the other side, but we just escaped that. In fact, a view from the other side a few days later, so this again is the Kennet, this is London Street Bridge, this is Queen's Road car park, and you can see the water's just starting to spill over onto the side. Another few centimetres and there would have been very large amount of flooding in central Reading, so we just about escaped that bullet. And in those 80 days, middle of December to the beginning of March, we had 382 millimetres of rain, which is 60%, 6/10 of what we normally get in a year, and we got in 2.5 months. At the opposite extreme, June 1976, I'm sure a number of people will remember this. This is a dried up pond at Twyford. So we had 382 in 80 days, and in 1975-76 we had 346 in 12 months. This is a range that our climate can produce. So less than half a normal year's rainfall. And a very hot summer and a very sunny summer that year as well. So here's how our summers have looked on our long records. And the individual blobs show the individual mean temperature for that particular summer, and the red line shows a 10-year moving mean. And you can see that summers have definitely got warmer, despite what people may think. Because if you look at last summer, 2015, if you take last summer, if you were back in 1974, that would have been the warmest summer since 1959. And yet now we think it's just an ordinary summer, in fact not a very great summer, because you see we've been used to several very good summers recently. 1975, 1976, 1983, 1989, 1995, 2003 and 2006. Now we're about overdue for another one, so I'm hoping we will get one this year, but that's not a forecast. Please don't tell the Daily Express. Our coldest summer was in 1922, and our warmest summers, 1976, and just pipped by 2006. Our warmest month, our hottest month on record to that time was July 1983, which was a persistently hot month. You can see we had 6 days above 30 degrees C. Now this has a particular personal reference for me because it was the month that Helen and I got married. Both of us working for the Met Office. We had a marvellous lead into our wedding day on the 23rd, and a couple of days beforehand, terrific thunderstorms. A really bad omen. Everybody at work said this is a really bad omen. But we're still married after 33 years, so it kind of worked out that badly. August 2003, we set our new highest record of 36.4 degrees C. And in July 2006, this was our hottest month, and it just beat July 1983 by half a degree. Not quite so persistent hot weather. You see, there's only 4 days above 30 degrees C, but it did rise to 35 on the 19th. Now this month, July 2006, was 3.5 degrees C above the long period norm, which is about what most of the climate models expect our summers are likely to be by the end of the century. So by the end of the century, July 2006 is likely to be a normal month. So that's really something to look forward to. But we're still making and breaking records. Let me show you the December mean temperature. This is the mean temperature we've observed for December on our records back to 1908. We had a very cold December in 2010. And until recently, our warmest, mildest Decembers were 1934 and 1974, both of which were around 8.1 degrees C. When I tell you that the last December was off the scale, I mean it was off the scale. It was 3 degrees warmer than any other December that we've had. In fact, it was milder than any previous November, December, January, February or March that we've had. Had it been in April, it would have been our 4th warmest April. And this is December. And the mean temperatures were more like we'd expect at the end of April or beginning of May. So a truly extraordinary month. We haven't stopped making interesting records. So in terms of the warmest month on record, the hottest month we've recorded was July 2006. But in terms of difference from normal, so above the average that we'd expect for that month, April 2011 holds or held that record. If we look at December, you can see how far above anything that we've had before that December was. Maybe we won't get another December that warm for 200 years, or it might happen next year. Who knows? Now, before I finish this particular section, I want to talk about tornadoes in Reading. Now, you may not think of Reading as Tornado Alley, but 2 researchers at the University of Manchester published this paper last year showing the incidence of tornadoes across Britain. And you can see the highest incidence of tornadoes. Well, it's between London and Reading. And in fact, Reading has a little bit of tornado history, because I don't know how many people have ever seen this. This is in St. Lawrence's churchyard. And this is in memory of Henry West, who was a carpenter working on the roof of Reading Station on the 24th of March 1840, when a tornado appeared and blew him off and killed him. This is the earliest known named person in a tornado fatality in this country. And because he worked on the railway, his colleagues erected a memorial to him at Reading Railway Station, which has been regularly renewed, and in fact it's still there. This is right on platform 7. How many people have ever seen this? A few people have. Good, I'm glad people have. Next time you're on the station, have a look for this. It's just right on one of the walls of the Pumpkin Cafe. We've had 5 tornadoes or whirlwinds in Reading since 1840. And I used to say, fortunately, this is the only known Reading tornado fatality. Until when I did this presentation once before, somebody pointed out to me that in the Lower Early tornado in June 1998, there was a kitten killed in a shed. So I stand corrected. I now say it's the only known human fatality. So I think on that note, I'll pass back to Roger, who will talk a little bit about Reading's climate and how it's changing.
So we've got over 100 years of weather records here in Reading. So how's Reading's climate been changing? Stephen's given some pointers to some changes in temperature over the years. I thought we'd look at temperature, rainfall and fog. Now, here's the annual average temperature shown as the black line with the black circles. And the red dotted line is the 10-year running average, as Stephen has indicated before. And the solid dashed red line towards the top right is the recent 30-year average. And there is clearly a rise in the black curve from bottom right to from bottom left, sorry, to top right. The temperatures have clearly been getting warmer. The 10-year running mean has changed from about 9.5 up until about 11 degrees, an increase of about 1.5 degrees in a century. And in fact, the 16 warmest years have all occurred in the last 27, 28 years. Rainfall, in contrast, shows very little change. The red dashed line goes up and down. There are fluctuations from decade to decade, but it always seems to right itself and go back to where it was before. We've had wet years, 1903. We've had dry years, 1921. We've had a few wet years recently that have been close to 1903, but not quite made it. But on the whole, over the year, there is no real change in rainfall totals here in Reading. Fog, however, is something different. Any of those of you who were around before the Clean Air Act of 1956 may well recognise photographs like this one on the right, which shows a double-decker bus being guided through the streets by a man with a torch. The man with the torch is attempting to locate the gutter at the edge of the road, the edge of the pavement. The white line was invisible, so he needed to know where the edge, the left-hand side of the road was in order to guide the bus through. And I remember my father telling me of similar stories. You know, you needed someone up ahead of you 2 or 3 yards, 2 or 3 metres, in order to identify where the next left turn was. Visibility was as bad as that. In fact, there's an anecdote that I like, which strictly speaking doesn't refer to Reading. It's Millwall in South London, but it concerned Reading Football Club in the 3rd round of the FA Cup in 1933. That match was abandoned due to thick fog. The players all walked off, as did the referee. Reading goalkeeper stayed in goal. He had no idea what was going on at the other end of the pitch. But the frequency of fog in Reading has halved over the last 50 years, and certainly I don't recall a picture like the one on the right. I guess I might have experienced that sort of thing when I was, less than 5 years old, but certainly not recently. And we certainly don't get fogs that last like that all day. We get thick fogs in the morning, but they're normally gone by lunchtime. But 25 years ago, March 1991, just down the road, just down the M4 near Hungerford, there was a phenomenal pileup. 51 vehicles, 10 people died in thick fog, and it was that led to the formation of the creation, the use of warning signals on motorways to warn drivers of fog. So just down the road from us. Now, the pocket registers, some of which you will have seen outside, have this column on the right-hand side labelled remarks in the earlier years, where the observer was encouraged to write down anything interesting that he might have seen, unusual thunderstorms, something, strange colours in the sky. If we look at the logbooks from here for March 1916, we find the phrases, the top one there, between the 5th and 6th of March, ZEP fright, ZEP in quotes, and between March 31st and 1st of April, ZEP number 2. And these were the days when the German Luftwaffe of the First World War was flying these large Zeppelins over eastern parts and southeastern parts of the UK, trying to bomb some of the industrial areas. And clearly, they'd got close to Reading. We're not absolutely sure whether they were seen or whether it was just a warning, because the sirens certainly did go off in some localities around here. But nevertheless, it's not just meteorology that you find in some of our logbooks and pocket registers. So we started with the weather 90 years ago. That's this morning's weather report. Remember, you can have this sent to you every morning via email if you want. Just go to the website and register. I don't need to tell you what the weather's been like. It's been fairly cloudy. It was cloudy this morning at 9 o'clock. It was cool. Temperature yesterday didn't rise above 8 degrees. It's not too bad for this time of year. I mean, it's cool in absolute terms, as I said earlier. It's been a warm month so far. Very little rainfall yesterday, barely 0.4 of a millimetre. But we did have a nice hail shower. I think it was the first one possibly this winter. And 3 hours of sunshine. So there's some extremes, some of which Stephen has mentioned, that have occurred here over the years. Temperatures ranging from 36 down to -14, so a 50 degrees Celsius range of temperature. 76 millimetres of rain in a day, just over 3 inches in old money, and a snow depth of up to 31 centimetres, for example. And our strongest gust, 88 miles an hour, somewhat larger than the ones that we had over the weekend and on Monday.
So just to finish off then, a little, perhaps some pointers towards what we hope will be the next 100 years. Because the observatory, as well as maintaining the daily climatological record, is clearly used for many other university purposes. So it's used a lot for teaching, and Roger's mentioned this a little. This is a master's course, learning about boundary layer winds, using the instruments on the observatory. It's very important that all of our students learn how to do weather observations, because while we have sophisticated technological equipment, not every country does, and we do have a lot of overseas students from Commonwealth countries, from less developed countries, and it's important that they know what a mercury thermometer looks like and how to read it, as well as how to use an automatic weather station. We also do a lot of research, and in fact you may not know that the ozone hole is monitored from the observatory. It's one of only 3 places in the country, in the UK, that actually measure the ozone layer. And here's a picture of the ozone concentration over the Northern Hemisphere, run by Environment Canada, using our measurements just yesterday. This is updated every 24 hours. And you can see at the moment, actually, we're in a sort of, what's the opposite of a hole? An ozone pile, perhaps, at the moment. But there was a bit of an ozone hole over northern Russia a couple of days ago. This is obviously important for the incidence of skin cancer and so on, particularly in the spring. So this is monitored from Reading as well. You may not have seen this on the campus. That's because it's not. This is the world's largest steerable weather radar, and this is at our research radar facility in Chilbolton, which is about 40 kilometres away in North Hampshire. This is linked directly to the university and to the observatory, and there's a lot of research done using this within the Department of Meteorology. There's also a lot of work done on instrument development. This particular instrument is measuring the temperature through a set of fine wires. They're very small and they can respond very quickly, so they're ideal for measuring things like turbulence and so on. So we do a lot of instrument development as well. We do a lot of community outreach. This is a group of secondary school children watching a weather balloon launch. And this is a great thing for enthusing children and really getting them involved in science. We do a lot with industry partnerships. This is a lightning detector. It's always a good thing to show people around the observatory because it looks like a flying saucer. But one of our master's students did a dissertation on this in cooperation with our industry partner a couple of years ago. We obviously cooperate also with government, and we measure ultraviolet levels at the university as well. So those days in the summer when you're warned not to go outside without a heavy dose of sun cream, that's because of some of the measurements that are done here at Reading. I put up some measurements from 2 days last summer, 30th of June and the 1st of July. This was the hottest day of the year because we haven't had any ultraviolet for 6 months. So I didn't want to show you flat graphs from yesterday. So we do a lot of scientific meetings. Here's a group of international scientists watching a balloon launch for a solar particle measurement that was sent up as part of that meeting. We do a lot of media. Television crews particularly love our observatory because there's always things going on in the background. There's a weather balloon, there's an anemometer whizzing around, there's the inside of a Stevenson screen, and it really helps the visibility of the university as well. We do lots of these every year. And of course, special events. And this isn't our Vice-Chancellor modelling the latest Specsavers television ad. This was an event we ran last March for the partial eclipse that we had. And we had in about 100 local school children. Unfortunately, the sun didn't play and we didn't see the sun. But again, it was a good piece of science research. So I think that's all we have time for. So shall we take questions?